Hey Union, Steve here. I've been approached by quite a few people in the past month or so who have talked to me about the possibility of starting a blog or even a video blog of some kind to just kind of discuss spiritual issues, to answer some questions maybe about some teachings here and there. And I had last night, as I taught last night at Union, had numerous people afterward at the restaurant ask me some really good questions about the teaching and about some other things in Scripture, and I thought, now is as good a time as any to start this thing. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a video blog for at least a little while. I'm in school for a bit, so the writing thing probably wouldn't happen as often, but I can just set up a camera and just do a couple of minutes of talking and put it up on YouTube, and hopefully it benefits people. But last night we talked about Peter and Jesus. We talked about Peter's epic failure, and we talked about Jesus' response to Peter's epic failure at the charcoal fire, and the fact that Jesus built a charcoal fire, which was the same kind of fire that Peter was warming himself in front of and standing in front of when he denied Jesus the first time during Jesus' arrest and eventual crucifixion. And so we looked at how Jesus restored Peter to ministry and to the rest of the disciples. It was a pretty cool section that we looked at last night. Coming from that, there were a couple of good questions that I just wanted to address really quickly. One of them was, why didn't Jesus address Peter's sin directly? In the section that we looked at the conversation that Jesus had with the disciples, that Jesus had with Peter in front of the disciples around the fire after breakfast. And the first thing that Jesus says to Peter about his sin is he asks him if he loves him. And then he does this 3 times, mirroring the 3 times that Peter denied Jesus. And he doesn't ever really specifically address Peter's sin. He doesn't say, hey, Peter, you did this. And, just kind of the typical way that we would think that someone would confront somebody else about their sin. And so I think it's a really good question. I think that something that we need to consider is that earlier on in the passage, it says that this was not the first time that Jesus appeared to the disciples, it was the 3rd time. And so I think from there we can kind of surmise that there had been other conversations had and we just don't have access to them. And we know that's true because in the Luke account, it actually says that Jesus appeared to Simon Peter before the rest of the disciples. And so I think that we can be reasonably confident that this conversation happened in private first, and that what we saw in the section we looked at last night in John 21 was more of a public addressing of the issue so that he can be restored to ministry and to leadership of not only the disciples, but leadership in what he would eventually go on and do and what we see recorded in Acts. Another really good question that came up as a result of that was how does this tell us, or how does this teach us about our confrontation of other people? I think that's a really great question too, and I think it's something that we need to pay attention to. Certainly we saw Jesus respond to Peter in a really loving way. We saw Jesus respond to Peter at his level. We talked about that, how the 3 questions were very different as compared to the 3 responses from Peter, and that Jesus came down and used Peter's language. But I think there's a couple other places in Scripture that can kind of help us out, and we can kind of put them together a little bit. One is from Matthew. It's another section of Jesus' teaching where he says this. He says in Matthew 18:15 and following, he says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. He kind of says that there are steps to this. It's good to confront and name the sin in a private setting. That's one way of actually being really loving with somebody, is not doing it out in public at first at least, but pulling somebody aside and saying, hey, this is what happened. But if he does not listen, this is verse 16, but if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. One thing that he tells us there is that privacy is important, that there are steps to it. And so that's another reason why we can probably be pretty reasonably certain that Jesus addressed Peter's stuff privately before he ever did publicly. And then lastly, in Galatians 6:1, Paul writes this, and I think it goes really well in concert with what Jesus taught. It says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. There's truth, the truth of what happened, and there's the grace in response to what happens. And I think that they're both married together, and I think they need to go together all the time, that they come together in full force, that I'm able to name the sin, but I'm also able to give a road out. And I think that's a really good difference for us. If I'm doing it because I want them to be set free from their sin, I'm giving them a road out. I'm not just saying, hey, here's what you did wrong. I'm saying, here's what you did wrong, here's how it hurt me, and here's how we make it better. I think if we're committed to confronting each other in the order in which that Jesus said, and if we're committed to confronting one another in a loving way with truth and grace and giving a road out, I think that gives us a really, really great roadmap for doing this in the future. I hope this is helpful. I hope it's just a couple of minutes of some question interaction. I'm going to try to do this maybe once a week, maybe a couple of times a week. And like I said, I hope it's helpful to you guys. See you later.